Welcome to the Throttle Up Leadership Podcast. Our theme for 2026 continues. The future of work, meaning is the new money. Because meaning is simply the greatest motivational force on earth. But 68% of the global workforce is disengaged, leaving $9.6 trillion in productivity on the table every year. Gen Z, the canary in the coal mine, is exposing structural failures everyone else learned to ignore, rationalize, or endure. I'm Dr. John Dentico, your host, bringing over 30 years of experience in leadership, strategic thinking, and designing solutions that solve real problems. This podcast delivers boots-on-the-ground intelligence, real conversations with CEOs, fractional executives, coaches, and small and medium-sized business leaders navigating the same crisis, mitigating the talent hemorrhage before competitive viability disappears. We go beyond symptoms like engagement scores and wellness programs to focus on the structural failures beneath them. Frontline intelligence, actionable frameworks, hard truths. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Now let's throttle up and dive into today's episode. Hello again and welcome to the Throttle Up Leadership Podcast. I am your host, Dr. John Dentico. With me today is Scott Geller. Scott Geller is a fractional chief financial officer who specializes in staffing agencies. But he didn't start out with that intention. He fell into his first staffing business fractional role, helping out another CFO in a critical moment, assuming staffing was like any other professional service business. He quickly learned otherwise. Staffing firms face unique cash flow and profitability challenges that generic financial guidance simply doesn't address. That discovery led Scott to build PathPredict and develop his 6-step method to building finance clarity and planning, a program specifically designed for staffing firms under $30 million in revenue or with a handful of recruiters. These are companies that don't need a full-time chief financial officer and may not even need a fractional CFO, but they absolutely need clearer financial guidance than their bookkeeper can provide. Scott's mission is direct: a CFO for every staffing agency. Through PathPredict, he gives these firms a clear financial picture of today, a strategic map of tomorrow, and the CFO guidance to get there. He also runs Capitist Advisors for broader fractional CFO services and hosts the Budget Your Business podcast. What makes Scott's story relevant to our conversation about the future of work is that he's living it. The fractional model, the niche specialization, the deliberate choice to serve a specific market that's been underserved by traditional finance models, and I'm truly pleased and delighted to have Scott here with me today. Good morning, Scott. How are you?
I'm doing well, John. I appreciate you having me on here. I'm eager to our conversation.
Oh, well, hopefully we'll have some fun and dive into the deep corners of CFO land. So let me ask you this. I like to start out by asking you a personal question and just tell me a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? And what were some of the fundamental influences in your early life?
So, John, thanks to my dad's work, I kind of moved all over the place. I started in Ohio. We went to Texas. We almost went to North Carolina. Instead, we went to Kansas City for about maybe 6 months. Then we went to Tennessee, then ended up in North Carolina, basically based on my dad's position. So he was an accountant/controller. We had to move. Every 4 or 5 years, I ended up going to high school in Raleigh, went to college at UNC Wilmington, which is on the coast of North Carolina, which is about, to me, one of the best places you can go to college is 10 minutes from the beach. I somehow managed to get my way through graduating as well as spending time on the beach and moved to Richmond, Virginia, where I thought I'd be 2 or 3 years, follow the pattern that I'd spent my entire life, a couple years here, a couple years there, making my way up through the corporate ladder. One thing led to another. It's almost 26 years later. I'm still in Richmond, Virginia. I've got 2 boys. My wife's a teacher. I've got some family in the area, and I am now a fractional CFO of my own business and don't think I could ever go back to that corporate world.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm actually working on what I refer to as a field report on I'm going after a big issue, and that's the lack of engagement of workers across the US and across the world. What can we do to increase the level of engagement? Its effect on productivity is immense, and worker happiness, meaningful lives, different things like that. And I've had the pleasure of talking to a woman by the name of Sarah Daw. Sarah Daw is the CEO of the Liberty Group that has 1,500 fractional people all around the world. And a lot of what you've just talked about, this notion of the ability to apply your expertise where it's needed and in a sense, not deal with all the administrivia per se of a bureaucratic organization, get in there, help out, fix, move on to the next thing, seems to be a theme that's catching on around the world. So I'd love to get any reflections you have on that.
Yeah, and John, right on the head. I spent the first half of my career in some of the biggest corporations in the world. Fell into a spinoff from Allianz Insurance Company. And to me, I saw the light where, you know what? We don't have to have all these extra steps just because we're a big company. I don't have to do analysis or work and throw it over the wall and kind of wonder where it goes. Instead, to your point, I can focus on exactly what the priority is for that business. I can focus on, if their immediate need is cash flow, guess what? We're talking about cash flow first. If their immediate need is something as simple as, let's get the operational excellence in the business standing up, meaning having a bookkeeper, using a software package, closing the book on a reasonable amount of time. Now, I'm not going to do the actual bookkeeping, but I'm going to help them find somebody. Or it might be, look, I want to sell in 6-9 months. Well, then let's focus on that. It's great in the fractional world, as well as it is, the biggest challenge as well as opportunity for me as a fractional is prioritizing what I'm working on so that the owner of the business and I are on the same page, and we're hitting that biggest impact as soon as we possibly can. And then we move on to the next thing. And that's okay. That's really what I enjoy doing.
Yeah. It's sort of like, what struck me when you were talking is, it's sort of like and I hope this metaphor sits well with you. It's sort of like a financial plumber. We have a leaky pipe, right? You don't come into a plumber doesn't come in to redesign the house per se. You have a leaky pipe. Okay, well, let's fix the leaky pipe. You're very specific, very focused, very targeted on the things that need to get done to bring health back to the organization. So it makes perfect sense to me. Let me ask this question. Staffing agencies have unique cash flow challenges. You're paying employees weekly while waiting 30, 60, 90 days to get paid by clients. Walk us through how this creates a profitability illusion, if you will. What do most staffing firm owners misunderstand about their own numbers?
Sure, that's a really good question, John. And that was one of the challenges that I saw when I started working with staffing companies, is this delaying cash. And one of the biggest pieces that I see that staffing owners don't really appreciate or kind of get their hands wrapped around, at least early on, is their profitability. And in staffing companies, there's typically 2 points of profitability. One is the pricing, and they all know their pricing. They all know, I'm placing this person at $50 an hour and I'm paying them $35 an hour. They know what that is almost every time up front, or they have a really good idea. What they don't know is on the back end if that's actually coming through the business, through the financials. And one reason is that they're looking at cash accounting. And the delay in the cash which you hit it as a staffing company, I'm paying these candidates. So people that staffing company is putting in place at another facility or location, they're paying them weekly, almost always weekly. However, the facility or their client that they're placing them at isn't going to pay them for 30, 60, sometimes 90 days down the road. So cash accounting is so hard to use to understand what's happening in a business. You're paying out rates of today, of this month, but then you're not getting the revenue on that for months down the road. So if you're looking at your margins, you're looking at a mix of revenue from 3 months ago compared to payroll that you're paying today. A lot of times it looks like an EKG reader, right? Like you're in the hospital and it's up here, it's dropping, it's up again, it's up even higher, and then it falls to the ground. How can you use that information? And you can't until you put it into accrual accounting. So that's one of the biggest hurdles that I see with staffing companies is that they're trying to manage financially their business financially on cash accounting when they should really be in accrual just because of this massive time difference. And then they're trying to compare that cash accounting margin to what their pricing margin is, or they're just relying on the pricing margin and not looking at what the financial margin is on the back end. So that's one of them that I see almost most businesses that I walk into, and it's not easy to put into place either.
Tell me about the health of the sub $30 million staffing agencies in a general sense. Do you see them growing or shrinking? I'm very curious because we're now enraptured in the world of AI. The question becomes, how does that affect the growth of the industry, if you will, or the compaction, if you will, of the industry? Where do you see the industry of sub $30 million staffing agencies going?
I think it's at a very interesting point. And one is because of the AI. There's a whole lot of effort and money going into, I talked to a lot of staffing firms that are putting money into AI. How can they place people? How can they find the next job using AI more and more and leveraging that? And I'm not really sure where that's going to go. I think what it's going to do is it's going to leave behind staffing companies that ignore it. And I don't know, John, if you have an opinion around other guests you've had on here around the impact of AI, but to me, I think if you don't start thinking about it and using a little bit, you're probably going to get left behind. I don't know if you're seeing or hearing the same thing from other guests and companies you talk to.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah. If you don't use it, it's like not having a cell phone. It's like not being in tune with the technology of today. Not maybe having a computer on your desk. And I understand people go off the grid. I get that. But still, many of them are off the grid. And they've got links. They're doing work via satellites or Starlink or something like that, connecting them with everybody. So, yeah, it's here. Learn how to use it. Learn how to use it wisely. Learn what it does and what you have to do to make it right. There's a lot of problems that are happening. I was just reading about it this morning that there are issues there. For example, there are people now who are feeding false information and creating this false factor. So that it's training itself on bad information is one thing.
Right.
The other thing too is with deep fakes and different things like that, this becomes a routine of the internet. So now it's training itself again on bad information. So it just keeps repeating bad stuff eventually. So the question is, what do you put into place to make sure that it's at some level being truthful or being honest, or you're using references, true references, for example, if you're doing a paper or something like that, that really match up to what people have written. It's here to stay. It's a revolutionary technology, but I'll tell you this. In fact, I was positing this to an AI engine the other day, and it came back and agreed with me. I was blown away, and that is the single greatest hack for AI. The single greatest hack. If you want to hack AI, here's how you do it. Put a person in the loop. That's the hack. So, because a person can look at it and say, no, that's not right. you know. And the fact that you're just going to feed information into it and expect it to bring you perfection is crazy. I use it all the time. I use it consistently, several different models every day. And it has not decreased my workload. It's made me more efficient. I'm just doing different things. I'm doing the background checking now, references or different things like that, making sure that okay, where did you get that information? Show me the link to the website or to the report. And, depending on which one you use, like in that area, I'll use like Perplexity, and it'll run out and say, yeah, go look over here. Okay, good. All right. That's a real number, that kind of a thing. So I absolutely agree with you. It's you got to learn it. You got to know it. But at the same time, you got to be very careful about what the results are. And as a human, we need to keep a checkup on it. And it's not going to get easier. It's going to get harder as the models become more mature. Go ahead. Any reflection on that?
Yeah, and John, I just want to follow. I agree with what you're saying there. And I don't know, this might come across as a little bit selfish being a fractional CFO, but I talk to businesses and people that say, oh yeah, I just throw my financials into ChatGPT or an AI tool and ask them, what do I do? And yes, you can do that. One, be a little careful because whatever you put into one of these tools is kind of out there. But two is just be careful because what comes back doesn't have a whole lot of perspective. It doesn't really have that real life experience sitting behind it. It's giving you back what it finds online. So that's my little bit of a warning that hopefully comes across the right way. Absolutely use it. Just be a little careful, especially if you're using it as like a CFO or a chief HR person or a chief legal officer. Just make sure you're doing a little bit of research or background or having somebody check behind it to make sure you're not just getting generic or sometimes misleading feedback.
I agree 100%. You have to stay on it. There's manual things. I'm writing a report. I'm manually doing the references. I'm manually going through the report. It highlighted where I need a reference. Okay. But I'll go through it manually at the same time and say, yeah, okay, let me go get that. Let me put that on the references page and different things like that. So, yeah, I absolutely agree. Let me ask you this question. In your working with different staffing organizations, do you ever run into EOS, Entrepreneurial Operating System? Are you familiar with that at all?
I've run into EOS with two clients. Neither of them were actually staffing companies, but I definitely talked to some staffing companies that are thinking about it and going down that path a little bit.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. I have an EOS question I'd like to ask you.
Sure.
Firms run on EOS or similar operating systems to create discipline and accountability. That's basically what they're doing. Where does financial clarity fit into those frameworks? And you may have to do a little bit of a projection here, but that's fine. Are you finding that firms with strong operational systems still have blind spots on the finance side? Or does the lack of an operating system create the financial chaos you're solving for? That's a bit of a complex question, and you may not have enough exposure to it, but I'll toss it to you and see what you think.
I'm going to use one of my clients as an example, and that they were on EOS. They had already started on the path down to EOS when I started working with them. So if you consider, I don't want to call it a race, but kind of two cars going down the road, I was a little bit behind the progress that they were making. And they had some really good questions that in the beginning I couldn't quite answer. So I couldn't give them the exact metrics that we needed to track from the financial side. However, what we were able to do was to work through what the goals are in the business and then kind of peel back the operational and match that up with the financial side of the business so that eventually we're running in tandem, right? We're kind of going down the road at the same speed. Now, I needed them to slow down a little bit and wait for me because I needed to understand the business. I needed to make sure I understood the operational data, how that impacted and drove the financials of the business. But eventually we got to a point where, hey, because I love working with metrics. I think metrics are incredibly important. So yeah, it worked well when we both started working together on that.
Yeah. So what you're telling me, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that you sort of attached yourself, in a manner of speaking, to the side of EOS and operated tandem, as you said, and synchronization with EOS. But the EOS system itself wasn't doing what you were doing per se. Does that sound about right?
You nailed it, John. Exactly. Because EOS is more than just financial. It hits other aspects of the business that I'm just not going to be able to get into. I'm not an operational person. I'm not an IT person, not an HR person. Now, I've seen enough where I can see red flags and say, hey, let's sound the alarms here. You need to go take a look at XYZ. But those aren't my areas of expertise. However, I love working with somebody that's putting structure in place and identifying metrics, because the finance, there's data there, right? There's information you can use that you can put metrics around. And then you have this partner on the EOS side that's driving a certain mindset in the business owner or leadership team that is a lot like a financial mindset, honestly, because you're trying to look at numbers, you're trying to look at steps you need to take in order to get to a certain goal in the business. And that's at least how I look at a business as well.
Yeah, I agree. The structure is important, but there's this tug of war that's going on with structure. And that is when the structure becomes too bureaucratic, if you will, in such a way that it restricts the ability. One of the greatest problems in bureaucracy is it hates change. It despises change. It's a machine. It was designed to be a machine. Just click along, go, click, click, just like a machine. And now in the world that we live in, things change from one day to the next. It has trouble tracking through that. While there is a structure, and that's great, you still have to have the ability to adapt and be agile with where the organization is and where it's going. And I think one of the things that I harp on all the time is having a sense of strategic clarity, having a mission statement that everybody can recite, one sentence. This is who we are, this is what we do. Simple as that. And so that there is this clear notion of what it is we're trying to do, why we're here, what do we seek to do. So it's very, very interesting to me. I know EOS is spread like wildfire. I see it as a management system. I don't necessarily see it fulfilling the full leadership aspects of an organization's need in the world today, because leadership is changing dramatically because of AI and the different things that we're facing in this hyper-dynamic world. I'd love to get your reflection you have on that.
Yeah, John, I'm going to jump on my soapbox here for a moment, if you allow me. Part of what you're talking about was the change in the world, right? The market's changing, your industry's changing, competitive challenges, pricing, AI, tariffs, you name it. There's always something that's being thrown in your face. Coming from the corporate world, and I see a lot of businesses doing this, is they create that budget. It's at the end of the year, they create a budget, January to December. They get into March, April, and things change, right? COVID, you name it, hits the fan, and they have to change a little bit. And they look at that budget and they're like, yeah, this just doesn't really work anymore. So what do I do with this? And they just move on. Over the years, especially the last 6 years since I've been a fractional CFO, I've gone down the path heavier and heavier. And I didn't come up with this term, but it's called beyond budgeting. And that is continually budgeting, continually look at the NTM, the next 12 months. Because when you're in June, if you're only looking at July to December, the first quarter isn't going to wait around for you. It's going to happen. And if you're not prepared for it, then you're going to find yourself in trouble. So instead of just creating that budget in fourth quarter, setting it up and saying, oh, this is what we're going to do, and then probably forgetting about it or it becomes irrelevant, why not continually going back to it? Why not continually forecasting what's going to happen in the business? And there's a couple key pieces and parts that you need in order to do that. You need to know the business drivers. You need to understand what's happening in the market. You need to have those metrics where you're tracking on the path to your goals. But you might have to change directions with your business. So if you're not constantly forecasting, constantly thinking about the strategic goals of your business, what can we change? Which direction do we want to go in? This whole kind of archaic budgeting process of do it once a year, January to December, and that's it. Maybe we update it as we go, but it's only through December. It's not bad. It's just using an old tool when there's so much value in reforecasting it, always thinking out what is the next 12 months cash? What is the next 12 months goals? What are the next 12-month profitability looking like? And the other great byproduct of that is when you get around to the next deep strategic conversation, it's 60, 70% already done because you're continuing to have those conversations. So you don't need to take a whole week off or a couple of days off and start from scratch every year. You're continuing that conversation throughout the year.
I'd say an interesting story. You hear the word vision all the time, right? We have to have vision. I have stepped away from this notion of vision. And I'll tell you why. I was influenced when I was doing my research many years ago by a book called Competing for the Future by C.K. Perhalat and Gary Hamel. And they said, listen, vision is like an apparition in many respects. What they preached, and I absolutely believe in, is something called foresight, having foresight. And now, I believe with AI, you can set out your strategic direction, do strategic thinking, not strategic planning, which for me comes before strategic planning. You have to do strategic thinking. And the way I differentiate the two is this. In strategic planning, when you talk about budgeting, for example, you're looking to find answers to questions. There are questions or goals or ends in mind. But the way I look at it is you're trying to answer questions. That's really what strategic planning is about. In strategic thinking, you're making sure you're asking yourself the right questions. So that's a big difference. You're not trying to solve the problems. You're trying to make sure you understand what the real problems are. So now with foresight, tracking the trends in demographics and politics and different things like that, and with the help of AI, you can now keep a really good running tab on how things are shifting in an organization's strategic world. So I think that helps then relate and flows right into strategic planning. Okay, well, hey, we may have to change things here in our plan, rebudget as we go, because the strategic inflection point for our firm, take a staffing firm, for example, right? A staffing firm who's now being pressed to find people with AI talent, right? I mean, I'm sure that you've seen that a bazillion times, right? Especially now in the last year. We need skills. We need a person who understands this, someone who can code, or someone who can vibe code, or different things like that. So that shifts everything for that agency if they want to, as we talked about earlier, maintain a level of profitability. So I agree. I think that now we have the tools to keep a running tab on things and be able to see when things shift pretty much as they shift. And that oftentimes will feed in, for example, take a staffing agency. No. You're filling these jobs over here. You really want to be filling these jobs over here. You want to market this segment of the world. I'd love to get any reflections you have on that.
You're right. And that is part of that continual thinking of, maybe you want to start placing certain different skills, or it's also just understanding, what the profitability is within the different skill sets that you have. Maybe you're placing healthcare, IT, and industrial. Maybe you're not making enough on industrial and you're better off putting that effort all behind healthcare. But until you understand what's happening, it's hard to make those decisions. And unless you're continuing to look at that, you might get to a point where you think you're making money in one area, but over time, you're not, right? And so the variables move on you. And unless you're constantly looking at it and assessing it, it's kind of hard to make those educated decisions about the business.
Yeah, I agree. Let me ask you this question. When you talk about staffing agencies, are we talking about short-term staffing, long-term staffing, or both?
It's typically considered contingent staffing, meaning it's not One of the lines to make is the difference between recruiting and staffing. Recruiting is where you're finding somebody and you're taking a little piece of the pie, a one-time fee. You're just helping hire one person and you're helping a company hire that person full-time. Whereas on the staffing side, you're helping putting a person in a role for a period of time. And the short-term versus long-term, there's different regulations and it really depends on what you staff. So you could have, go out to like an industrial where you could place somebody there on a project for several months. You might have on the healthcare side where there's certain regulations where you can't place somebody longer than, say, I'm trying to think exactly what the number is, like let's say 12 or 13 weeks before they have to move on to somewhere else, or they're considered like a full-time employee. So the timing is dependent on a lot of the state, the skill, what they're working on. If it's an employee of record versus staffing, versus putting somebody there part-time. But there's a distinct difference between recruiting and staffing.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, I get that now. Let me ask you this. Is it true to say that pretty much staffing agencies, the people that they're bringing in to staff and then later on actually send to an organization, would you say it's driven primarily by skills?
Yes, it is. I mean, you'll see staffing companies that have multiple different skills that they'll place, but a lot of times you'll see their healthcare, their retail, some focus. I was talking to one where it's kind of interesting. They have a niche where they only place people at apartments. So the staff that work in apartment complexes, and that's all they staff. But yes, to your point, it's usually dictated around the skill.
Yeah. I would see recruiting, just as a curiosity, I would see recruiting being more oriented or having a bigger play with things like values, like a value system of an individual being recruited into an organization, but staffing being less so in the sense that it's really about skills and applying skills to a particular job. Does that sound feasible to you?
I would say on the recruiting side, it's more important. At the same time, you don't want to place somebody that is going to show up and take off after a couple of days or show up and do a bad job, because then as a recruiter, the staffing company, you're losing face, or it's damaging the relationship you have with that client. So that's damaging the opportunity you have of bringing somebody new in and placing additional people with that client.
Yeah, very interesting. Let me ask you this. We're getting close to the end. It's been a very intriguing and informative conversation. So let me ask you this. For Scott Geller, where do you see yourself going in the next year or two? What is your hope for the future in your fractional world?
Yeah, so the PathPredict is relatively new for me. I've been working with staffing companies for a couple of years. I just stood up PathPredict over the last year. And that's where a lot of my focus is really bringing those critical pieces that I've seen that are critical to staffing companies on that size of less than 30 million in revenue at a price point that makes more sense for them so they can have access to that CFO. That's where my focus is. Majority of my focus is. I still have fractional clients. That's really where my focus is over the next year, is getting that in the market, building awareness, and seeing how that sits with the market. I've gotten a lot of good feedback. Again, it's still relatively early. So that's where my focus is right now. On the personal side, I've got a senior in high school. And, like my wife and I are talking about something in October of this year. And I'm like, wow, he's not going to be here. He's going to be at school next year at that time. So on the personal side, it's kind of committing to the family and making sure that we're taking advantage of the next couple months here before he's off to college and hopefully after that off on his own.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's kind of my commitments this year, is spreading the word around PathPredict and then making sure I'm keeping that time with the family.
Tell me exactly what PathPredict is. Is it a tool? Is it a system? Give me something to hang on to in terms of what it is and what it does.
PathPredict is a 6-step method that I put together for a staffing company to understand their financials, gain strategic planning, and then have access to a CFO. That's essentially what it is. What those 6 steps are I perform a financial health check, let's make sure the key components are in place before we even get started. The second is we build out the metrics, the goals and the metrics to track our progress to those goals. In order to do that, we sit down to strategic planning session. I walk them through a financial strategic planning deep dive in the business. We identify what the goals are, metrics to track ourselves there. Third is we build out the budget. So we set what that budget is for the next 12 months. The fourth is integrating the financial tools. And these are models, dashboard facing, but with the details behind it, with scenario planning, stress testing that we can perform, but specifically for staffing. So we pull those in. That's step 4. Step 5 is where we build the financial muscle. And these are monthly meetings with a CFO experienced in staffing. We're going to talk about what happened last month. We're going to talk about the challenges you have in the business, the next 12 months, right, that we talked about earlier. Whatever that owner needs to have conversations around with business that maybe can't have with others or doesn't have the experience, we're going to sit down every month and have those. And then the 6th step is a financial debrief where we're going to take a pause and look back over the last 12 months. So this program is intended to cover 12 months. And we're going to have another deep dive into what happened. We said XYZ, we ended up doing ABC. Why did we do that? What did we learn from it? Because that's a step that I find is so often missed in businesses because you're driven by what's happening today, right? You're driven by the pricing, a new client, losing an employee. And it's rare that they actually stop and look back and actually kind of talk about what their decisions were and what they learned from that so we can feed that back into the machine. So that's what the 6 steps are. To me, it's those critical components to have in place without the significant overhead of a full-time CFO that's going to cost you. If you have a real one, a good one, it's going to cost you $300,000, even for a small business. But it gets you a CFO at a rate and level of engagement that makes sense for those smaller companies.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. We know that the backbone of a business in America is small and medium-sized companies.
Absolutely.
75, 80, 75 to 78% of the business in America, number one. I believe, and have found no one who contradicts this so far, is that we are now in the midst of an entrepreneurial age where people have the ability, because of the technology that sits right before us here today, to go out and start their own businesses. There are so many new businesses that are being created. Yeah, many will fail, but a lot will succeed. And they're going to need help to stay on track, progress, and produce in the future. So there is this undercurrent that's happening. And I see it, and I've actually seen another podcaster who's talking about it too. And I don't think people recognize it yet. And actually has something to do with staffing. So let me just say it. In terms of hiring, let's talk about recruiting. Let's just shift over to the recruiting side of the equation for a second. In terms of recruiting, organizations have always had the upper hand, right? People go through recruiting, they go through training, and they take courses to learn how to interview, for example, right? What are the questions you're going to be asked? Always trying to take a person and mold them to fit into the organization's value system, if you will, the organization's goals, mission. It may take years, but I see a change happening. And you see it prolifically in Gen Z. And this is part of my report. Gen Z, the report is, one of the taglines in the report is, Gen Z are the canaries in the coal mine. What they're doing is they're showing us the things that have been wrong for all of us. They won't put up with it. They're just going to say, no, I don't want to do that. Makes my skin crawl. I can't be part of an organization like that. I see a shift happening where eventually what's going to happen is, simply stated, is that the talent is going to drive the market instead of the market trying to drive the talent. And that's a great deal of the report that I'm writing about right now, is what that shift is going to look like and why it's going to be that way and what you can do as an organization to help. So we'll see where that all works itself out. But it's a very, very interesting dynamic because I see in staffing, for example, even that is going to get affected by as more and more Gen Zers join, and then the Gen Aers as comes along behind them. The Gen Aers are going to be even more so, I think, in terms of looking for an organization that fits with their value system rather than them fitting with the organization's value system. I think there's a great potential to match up, but people have to focus on it and think about it. Anyway, we'll see what the future brings, Scott. A great conversation. I can't thank you enough for your time here today on the Throttle Up Leadership Podcast. I wish you all and your family the greatest success in the future. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, John. I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Thank you. This is Dr. John Dentico. Remember, meaning is the new money, but it requires building the structures that deliver it. If today's conversation challenged your thinking or gave you a framework worth implementing, share it with a leader who needs to hear it. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and visit throttleupleadership.com for more resources. Until next time, keep throttling up and keep the people at the center of everything you do.